G'day, Professor Joseph Rue. As many of you know, I've been a professor, academic for decades. I'm an editor of one of the better journals out there. And what I'm finding is that we're getting more and more petty and vicious reviews coming through and petty and vicious reviewers coming through. And if you're a scholar or you want to be a scholar, you're going to have to learn how to deal with it, how to avoid the problem in the first place, and then if you do encounter it, despite your best efforts, what to do next. In this video, I'll go through the steps. So, essentially, we've got an epidemic of vicious and petty reviewers, and it imperils the whole scholarly academic world. It imperils the whole scholarly journal writing process when we're getting bad feedback from people who sometimes don't know what they're talking about, sometimes just being mean and nasty rather than constructive, sometimes um, just being obstructive to the process. That imperils the whole scholarly process, and we should all be very concerned about it. Now, this has grown exponentially in the last decade or so, and particularly since the time of COVID. And there's probably three main reasons why we're now plagued by vicious reviews. One is that following COVID, a lot of universities in Australia and abroad had redundancy programs because the foreign students weren't coming out, their revenue was cut, so they cut their expenditure. And who were the main victims of these redundancy programs? They were mainly your older, more experienced professors. Now, that's a great loss to the whole world because these people are at the top of their game. They have the experience, they have the knowledge, they have the time, and they're motivated to give back to other scholars. They're at that period in their career where they're thinking about their legacy and how to improve the scholarly community so that things keep muddling along after they retire. And all of a sudden, that group of people were just taken out of the academic world. And what we've been replaced with is a lot of casual scholars, a lot of young, inexperienced scholars who don't have the time, who don't have the knowledge, who haven't yet learnt that it's much better to encourage people constructively than try to demolish them to make yourself feel better about things. So this is the biggest problem, I think, is that those redundancies of mainly the senior academics in Australian universities and universities overseas. In another video, I told you, editors, such as I am still, can't get reviewers, let alone good reviewers. And these are at the good journals. We have a crisis and no one's really addressing it. So that's a problem. Number two, we're now getting people coming through who have done PhDs, which are much more like opinion pieces than evidence based, facts based, reason based, theory based thesis. There's too many universities responding to the incentives from government who have started up PhD production facilities, and the quality of some of these PhDs, I've had two sent to me in the last year that should have been rejected, should never have been sent out for review. They were opinion pieces. There just wasn't any evidence. There wasn't any discussion of theory. What theory was discussed and appealed to was done poorly or wrong. And it's a real concern because in both these instances, I know the people ended up getting through the process. So that's a problem. The next problem is all the, um, we call them pretend professors, all the academics who aren't actually academics at all, who haven't gone through the process of getting a thesis, working their way up through the ranks. Particularly ex-public servants, a lot of them are being called professor and now running institutes and schools at universities who haven't actually got a publication record, who haven't gone through the PhD process, who haven't got the skills and the knowledge to be producing good reviews for journals. Now, journals, unfortunately, aren't weeding them out of the selection process. So it's quite common for reviews to be invitations to be sent out to people now who aren't what old-fashioned people like me would call proper academics. So that also explains the strange reviews and some of the vicious reviews that are coming back. So as I say, this is all an extremely big concern and something that we need to intervene in. The universities need to intervene, the journal operators need to intervene, and the government needs to intervene to make sure that we don't create a scholarly vacuum in the future, particularly with all these redundancies. But we're stuck with the situation we're stuck with. You need to know how, first of all, how to avoid getting a vicious, nasty, petty review. And one of the big ways you can do it is to suggest or oppose reviewers. Most journals allow you to do that. Now, as an editor, I'm actually happy when people suggest reviewers, because usually the people have enough knowledge to be able to conduct a review. We get an email address of someone who might be interested in doing the review, and that makes my life easier. The only problem, the only reservation I have about this is I need to look into it and make sure that there's not a conflict of interest. You need to hope that the reviewers are going to be virtuous scholars and do their review based on the material in front of them, not because of some sort of association or conflict of interest with the author. But that's certainly an option, is to suggest reviewers, and if you're not doing it, I think you're mad, particularly if you come from a little country like Australia. Most foreign reviewers, particularly from the Americas, don't get Australia and are probably going to reject you just because it's not about America. So if you're not suggesting Australian reviewers, you're doing yourself a disservice. If you get an American reviewer through Lucky Dip, chances are you're going to get rejected because they won't understand it. They won't be bothered understanding it. And let's face it, most Americans only like American scholarship. You need to also consider, do you need to oppose reviewers? I don't like doing it because it reflects badly on that person, but there's one person in particular in Australia, former colleague, who has an axe to grind with several of his former colleagues, who does unconscionable things. When he gets an invitation to review for people and he recognises the writing, he delays the review by, last time it was over 6 months and the review never came through. He knows very well all that time we're sitting waiting for the reviews to be done, which means we can't get an answer, which means the paper's sitting there at the journal rather than going through the process it should be going through to get published. If he then does write a review, when he finally gets hassled enough by the editor, it's a review that shows he hasn't even bothered reading it, and he's got a severe bias, and the intent is to have us rejected. The last journal that this particular person did it to, the editor said to ignore the review because it's so obvious what was being done. And now making sure that I oppose that reviewer. Happened in an A-ranked journal recently. It was sitting there languishing for 9 months, and I'm almost certain it was that particular reviewer. And this is before I decided to start opposing him. And all it did was waste 9 months of my time. The journal eventually rejected it based on one review, which isn't even the process for a journal, scholarly journal, let alone a scholarly journal of an A-rank standing. So you need to face reality. If you can identify who the nasty, vicious reviewer is, maybe you need to oppose them. The other thing you need to think about is your reference list. When a paper is submitted, there's an automatic matching system. One of the ways you can end up having something sent out to a reviewer, and I've tested this, I've been on both sides of the fence and tested this, I know it works this way, is if your reference list contains that reviewer. There is a small group of reviewers in a particular part of public management theory who think they own that space, and they ruthlessly make sure no one else can ever get to publish in that space, particularly critiques of their particular work. And I learnt the hard way, if they were in the reference list, the chances were I was going to get a review back from one of those people, and it was always obvious who they were because of how they were writing and who they were citing. And I just realised I had to leave them off the reference list once I started doing it. I then got sensible, sane reviewers, and those papers got accepted. So be discerning about who's in your reference list. Anyone you do reference, there's a fair chance they could be a reviewer of your work. How not to respond? Well, first of all, don't argue with the editor. It'll get you absolutely nowhere. In fact, it'll get you desk rejected next time, or your paper next time sent out to even more irksome reviewers. Is not going to achieve anything. Remember, the editor is the person that selects reviewers. The editor is the person that desk rejects you or not in future submissions. So unless you're intending to never submit to that journal or any journal ever again, they all talk, I suggest you just thank the person and suck it up. I actually did argue once with an editor of a very good journal who's still an editor of that journal. And it's probably time he needs to change, but and the review comment was talking about empirical strategies, and he was just completely plain wrong, as anyone who had a basic knowledge of econometrics would have known. And I pointed it out to the editor, and the editor wrote back and said, "Look, you're right, the reviewer was wrong, but we've all been there. Suck it up, it's still rejected. Thanks for wasting my time." And that's the sort of response you can expect, so just don't do it. And second of all, don't argue with the reviewer. It's not going to get you anywhere. It's not going to get you accepted. They're not going to suddenly change their mind. As W.H. Riker said, the problem with rhetoric is that it requires people to admit that they were previously wrong. And most people aren't going to make the admission. So don't bother. Don't even try. What to do instead? Learn from experience. Learn about whether this is a decent journal with good editors, whether it's a racist journal. There's racist journals out there that will reject you if you're from a particular country. I've proven that many times. I've seen it many times. Try to identify the reviewer. If you've struck a nasty, vicious, petty reviewer, try to identify them. You often can by their writing, by who they cite or reference, if they cite or reference someone, usually themselves. And once you identify them, try to avoid being exposed to those people in the future. Identify journals with inept, incompetent editors and don't bother. There's a journal in Australia that's a putatively A-ranked journal, and there's a new editorial board there, and I'm just not willing to review all to submit to them because the editors aren't interested in proper scholarly, empirical, evidence-based work. So why waste my time? But I will keep an eye on the journal, and when the editors change, well, then I'll have another go. But at the moment, there's no point. And that's happened many times in journals in the past. I got a very good piece of advice once from my old boss, Emeritus Professor Dollery, and he said, editors change. Don't write off a journal because you're having a bad experience with an editor. Just wait. Every year or two, they usually change. Occasionally, you get journals where they stick around for a decade. That's really bad practice on behalf of the journal. They should be rotating editors. Otherwise, they turn into little kingdoms and little clubs, like this journal that I'm thinking of right now. Identify your own shortcomings. Usually the reviewer, even if they're nasty and vicious, has a point. Maybe they've completely got the wrong end of the stick, completely confused. But is the problem the fact that you weren't clear enough? Don't go straight for they're the problem, it's all their fault. You've got to accept some of the responsibility yourself. You've got to do a certain level of introspection and think, what is it that I could do that could avoid this problem in the future? There's usually something you can do. So do that. Identify your own shortcomings. Look for those kernels of truth. Don't just flick it onto the next journal and learn nothing from the experience. Look, being a scholar is a tough gig. Being an editor of a journal is a tough gig, and it's got so much harder in the last couple of years, and it's going to get harder still, given what the universities and governments around the Western developed world are doing. So I wish you all the best. Help me out. Like, subscribe, flick it on to one other person so I can help others and we can all flourish. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.